In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans and the sources of their division. We learned in the previous lesson that the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars led to division between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. The Federalists supported the Democratic Republicans supported the French Revolution because the Democratic Republicans, being primarily of the poor in the country, supported the idea of an unjustly treated poor rising up against nobles and their king. The Federalists, however, thought that this idea was appalling. The reason is, if you had to make a comparison between the French nobles and the people in the Americas, a similarity would be between the elite and the French nobles. And if a situation similar to the French Revolution would happen in the Americas, it would be Charles Pinckney, Alexander Hamilton, and other Federalists who would be taking trips to the guillotine. Now, the Federalists also took an action that made the Democratic Republicans wonder how they could do such a thing. France declared war on Britain, and the Federalists sided with Britain, the ex-mother country, so they can secure more trade. The Federalists said, how can anyone side with our old enemy, Britain? The Napoleonic Wars would lead to an episode known as the XYZ affair between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. This happened when there was challenges to American neutrality, and President John Adams, Washington's successor, the second president, sent Charles Pinckney and two other American diplomats to France. When they got there, instead of being met by the ruler of France, someone called the Marquis de Talleyrand, they were met by three French officials who asked Charles Pinckney and Elbridge Gerry for a bribe. The American diplomats, of course, were incensed by this and said, America will spend millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. And French, you will not get a sixpence out of the Americas. This led to a quasi-war between America and France. This episode, of course, was known as the XYZ affair. The notes pick up today with the XYZ affair and how it would shape the politics in America. So the XYZ affair would result in conflict between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists, who were the one who were shamed by the French request for a bribe, yelled out, "War with France," because they wanted war. Charles Pinckney, the Federalist leader from South Carolina, said, "Yeah, war with France. I'm the one they asked for a bribe. How dare they ask me for a bribe?" The President, John Adams, he was ready to ask Congress for a declaration of war against France for slighting America with a bribe. And he wanted to teach the French a lesson. Well, the Democratic Republicans used this unrest against the Federalists against them, and they used their influence in the newspapers to attack John Adams and the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans, of course, they were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They had support from the poor people, such as upcountry South Carolina, backcountry Massachusetts, and other areas where the wealthy were not. So, what they did is they vilified John Adams. They attacked John Adams in the newspapers. And Thomas Jefferson pretty much said, John Adams is bad. James Madison said, a villain. And they attacked them in the newspapers that were controlled by the Democratic Republicans. The news read something like this: John Adams is bad. He's a villain. They vilified him. They had a picture of John Adams on the newspaper, and they said, oh, because of a misunderstanding between the French and Charles Pinckney, they want to go to war with France. They want Americans to die because they cannot handle being asked for a bribe in France. Well, John Adams being vilified in the newspapers will lead to the following. The Federalists, as we learned in the last section, they had control of the three pieces of government needed to easily pass a bill into a law. John Adams was the president. And they had a majority in the House and the Senate. As you know from the section on government, if you have control of the House, control of the Senate, and a president who will sign a bill, you can pass bills into laws that you wanted. Well, the Federalists got sick of being vilified in the newspapers, and they passed a law that many would deem as unconstitutional. And what they passed was two laws that were called the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. The Alien Act sought to limit the political power of the Democratic Republicans. Many new immigrants supported the Democratic Republicans, and the Federalists, felt that if they could make it harder to become a citizen and harder to vote for these immigrants, the Democratic Republicans would not have any power to oppose them. So the Alien Act made it so new immigrants can be deported, and it was harder to vote. It also made it to where new immigrants to the country, prior to the Alien Act, after 5 years they would become citizens. Well, when the Alien Act was passed, that was moved to 14 years, and only citizens could vote. Now, the Sedition Act would target the newspapers, and it would make it illegal to criticize the government. Now, hopefully, you're thinking what John Adams or what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison was thinking, that passing of an act that limits the newspapers and what they could publish is a violation of the First Amendment and the Bill of Rights, freedom of the press. Well, that is the way many people felt. So, to review, the XYZ affair results in the Federalists wanting war with France. The Democratic Republicans felt this was a major mistake and used their influence with the newspapers to vilify John Adams. This leads to the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts were controversial, perhaps unconstitutional acts that would stop the growth of the Democratic Party and limit the power or silence its newspapers. Well, in fact, some people never listened to this, and newspaper editors were put in jail as a violation of the Alien and Sedition Acts. One of these was a newspaper editor named Thomas Cooper. Rightly so, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison said, "These acts are a violation of freedom of the press, the First Amendment." And they would take steps that would result in a new theory of government being started. So, these political conflicts, after the XYZ affair, the Federalists prepared for war with France. The Democratic Republicans vilified John Adams in their newspapers. Since the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were designed to limit the growth of the Democratic Republican Party and silence its newspapers. Several newspaper publishers were jailed, and the Democratic Republicans decried this as an attack on freedom of the press. Here is John Adams' real picture, the Federalist who signed the bill for the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Sedition Acts would be met with a paper from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. This paper was known as the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. Thomas Jefferson was from Virginia, James Madison was from Kentucky. And this paper would actually become important to South Carolina because the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions would have to do with states' rights. And what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison said, even though this was proved wrong by the Civil War, is that states have a right to nullify or not follow a law they believe to be unconstitutional. Now, this would become known as nullification. And South Carolina, in the years just prior to the Civil War, would want to nullify some federal law, such as a protective tariff. And when they bring this idea up to the federal government, they look back upon the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. And just like you cite papers in your TDAs and other composition papers, they cited the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which was the first time that states' rights would be brought up. So the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they were written in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And it was that states have a right to nullify or not follow a law they believe to be unconstitutional. Let's look at what the PowerPoint says. So, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wrote the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which said states had the right to nullify an act of Congress that they found to be unconstitutional. Their main grievance was with the Alien and Sedition Acts. These would become the foundation of the states' rights doctrine. To look further at why the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, they were in conflict with the Bill of Rights. Once again, the Anti-Federalists wanted the Bill of Rights added. Good thing they did, because this is where we get many of our protections. And if you look at the Bill of Rights, Amendment 1 gives 5 freedoms. Amendment 1 is usually just the freedom of speech. However, the freedom of speech expands to the freedom of the press. And when Congress passed specifically the Sedition Act, they were denying people the freedom of the press. The freedom of the press being the freedom of newspapers to print whatever they want. This was illegal in the British Empire to criticize the king. So they felt that we needed this freedom. And as you can see, John Adams and the Federalists even tried to take it away. There's about 3 minutes of video left, so I'm going to review some of the things that have been covered the past couple days, which are the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists are the first 2 political parties. They differed on many issues, such as paying and assuming state debt, the creation of a national bank, the creation of a protective tariff, and, in general, that the Federalists wanted a strong national government, while the Democratic Republicans favored a government that was not as strong. The direction in which the country would head was also a point of disagreement between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, where Democratic Republicans favored a republic of small farmers and shopkeepers rather than manufacturing, which was an idea that the Federalists wanted, that the U.S. would become a powerful country like Great Britain, where the Democratic Republicans envisioned a country where we kind of just stay to ourselves and, you know, live happily without being involved in world affairs. Of course, the National Bank was the biggest point of disagreement between the 2 parties, and this led to the strict versus loose interpretation of the Constitution, where a strict interpretation limits the power of government because only those things that are explicitly stated by the Constitution were actions that could be done by the government. However, what we have is a loose interpretation. And the loose interpretation, which enabled the Federalists to create the National Bank, was made possible by the Necessary and Proper Clause. Last, another point of disagreement between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans was the assumption of national debt and state debt. Democratic Republicans, they said no, while Federalists wanted this. This was the one thing in South Carolina, or the one thing that both parties in South Carolina agreed upon. The Federalists, like Charles Pinckney in the Low Country, wanted the assumption of state debt, and so did the Democratic Republicans in the Up and Back Country. this union on the assumption of national debt was because 137 battles were fought here. So everyone in South Carolina was in favor of the national government taking over the state debt. In the next lesson, we will learn more about the Federalists and Democratic Republicans and the eventual end of the Federalist Party and why that happened. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.